Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Perfect Life. Alexander Ferris stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his Chicago Fire Department uniform for what would be the last time as an innocent man. At 35, he was the kind of firefighter who ran toward danger while others fled, a decorated veteran with 12 years of service. His broad shoulders and steel-gray eyes had earned him respect among his peers and the unwavering love of his wife, Beverly. Beverly McKnight Ferris was everything Alexander thought he wanted in a wife. A stunning real estate agent with flowing auburn hair and emerald eyes, she had pursued him relentlessly 5 years ago. Her family owned McKnight Properties, one of Chicago's most successful real estate firms, and Beverly had inherited both the business acumen and the ruthless ambition that came with it. Alexander had been blinded by her beauty and apparent devotion, never seeing the calculating coldness beneath her perfect smile. "You're going to be late," Beverly called from the kitchen, her voice honey-sweet but somehow distant lately. Alexander found her preparing his usual coffee, her movements mechanical. "Brian's picking me up in 10, Alexander replied, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. She stiffened slightly, a reaction he'd noticed more frequently over the past months. "Everything okay? Just tired from showing houses all weekend." She lied smoothly, the same way she'd been lying for the past 6 months about her afternoon meetings and late-night client calls. Brian Garner's truck honked outside. Alexander's partner and best friend for 8 years. Brian was the kind of man who commanded attention without trying. Tall, dark-haired, with a charming smile that had gotten him out of more trouble than any man deserved. Brian was also the most trusted person in Alexander's life. They'd saved each other's lives countless times, shared countless beers, and Brian was the godfather to the children Alexander and Beverly never had. "See you tonight." Alexander kissed Beverly's cheek, tasting the expensive perfume that seemed different lately. A gift from her grateful client, she claimed. As Alexander climbed into Brian's truck, he noticed his partner's unusually tense demeanor. "You look like hell, Garner." "Rough night," Brian muttered, avoiding eye contact. In truth, Brian had spent the evening planning the next phase of his betrayal, his guilt eating at him even as his desire for Beverly and the promise of her family's wealth drove him forward. Brian Garner had grown up in the South Side projects, fighting for every scrap of respect and success. When he'd met Beverly McKnight at a charity function 6 months ago, he'd seen more than just a beautiful woman. He'd seen his ticket to a life he'd only dreamed of. Beverly, bored with her stable, honorable husband and hungry for excitement, had been an easy target for Brian's dangerous charm. "There's something I need to tell you about tonight's call," Brian said as they drove toward the station. "Old warehouse on Porter Street. Could be messy." Alexander studied his partner's profile. "Since when do you brief me on routine calls?" "Just want to make sure we're both ready." Brian's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "This one feels different." What Alexander didn't know was that Beverly had spent the morning making final arrangements. The warehouse belonged to one of her clients, a man who owed her family significant favors. The electrical fire would be perfectly timed, and Brian would ensure Alexander was in exactly the right place when the structure collapsed. The insurance payout on Alexander's life would be substantial, and Brian had already agreed to split it with Beverly once they were married. At the station, Lieutenant Gerard Myers briefed the team on the warehouse fire. A decorated 20-year veteran, Myers had always been fair but demanding. "Ferris, Garner, your first response team. Building's old, structure's compromised. Be smart out there." As they prepared their gear, Alexander noticed Brian checking his watch repeatedly. "You got somewhere else to be?" "Just want to get this over with," Brian replied, the weight of his planned betrayal making every word feel like swallowing glass. The call came at 8:47 p.m. As they raced toward Porter Street, Alexander felt an inexplicable chill. He'd learned to trust his instincts over 12 years of firefighting, and something about this call felt wrong. The building was already fully engulfed when they arrived, flames reaching toward the night sky like grasping fingers. "Looks like we're going in blind," Alexander shouted over the roar of the fire. Brian nodded, his jaw set with grim determination. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text from Beverly. "Is it done?" He deleted the message and followed Alexander toward the flames, carrying the weight of his betrayal like a lead vest. Chapter 2. The Web Titans. 3 days before the warehouse fire, Beverly McKnight Ferris sat in the Oak Room of the Drake Hotel, her manicured fingers wrapped around a martini glass as she waited for her lover. The afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, casting everything in golden light that made her auburn hair shimmer. To any observer, she looked like a successful businesswoman enjoying a quiet drink. They couldn't see the predator beneath the polished exterior. Brian arrived 15 minutes late, his firefighter's uniform traded for jeans and a leather jacket that Beverly had bought him. Sorry, Alexander wanted to grab dinner after shift. My husband, Beverly said the words like they tasted bitter, is becoming a problem. He's starting to ask questions about my schedule. Brian slid into the booth across from her, his dark eyes troubled. Maybe we should slow down, give him more time. Time. Beverly's laugh was sharp as broken glass. I've wasted 5 years of my life playing the devoted wife to a man who thinks small. Do you know what Alexander's biggest ambition is? Making lieutenant. Meanwhile, I'm building an empire. She wasn't exaggerating. In the 6 months since their affair began, Beverly had leveraged her family's connections to acquire 3 major properties at below-market prices. The McKnight family had built their fortune through calculated risks and carefully orchestrated accidents, and Beverly had inherited more than just business sense. She'd inherited a complete lack of conscience. The warehouse job has to look completely accidental, Beverly continued, sliding a manila envelope across the table. These are the building plans. I've marked the structural weak points. Brian opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were detailed architectural drawings, several photographs, and a timeline. Beverly, this is murder. This is business, she corrected coldly. Alexander's life insurance policy is worth $2 million. Combined with my inheritance of the McKnight properties when we're married, we'll have enough capital to expand beyond Chicago. Brian studied the plans, his stomach churning. The warehouse was a death trap waiting to happen. Beverly had chosen it specifically because the owner, James Wall, owed the McKnight family substantial favors dating back to her father's era. Wall had agreed to ensure the building's sprinkler system would mysteriously malfunction and that the electrical fire would start in exactly the right location. The support beam here, Beverly pointed to a red X on the blueprint, will fall exactly 43 seconds after you and Alexander enter. You'll have enough time to reach the exit. He won't. What if something goes wrong? What if I can't get out in time? Beverly's smile was colder than winter wind. Then I collect on both policies and find new partner. The casual way she said it made Brian's blood freeze. For the first time, he fully understood what Beverly McKnight Ferris was capable of. But by then, he was already too deep in her web to escape. That evening, Brian sat in Murphy's Tavern, the firefighters' usual hangout, watching Alexander laugh at a joke from their colleague Ricardo Klein. Alexander looked so trusting, so genuinely happy, that Brian had to excuse himself to vomit in the bathroom. When he returned, Alexander was studying him with concern. You feeling all right? You've been off all week. Just tired, Brian lied, signaling the bartender for another whiskey. How's Beverly doing with her big real estate deal? Alexander's expression brightened. She's been working around the clock. Some major commercial property downtown. She says if this goes through, we might finally have enough for that house we've been looking at. Brian nodded, knowing that Alexander would never live to see that house. She's a determined woman. That's why I married her, Alexander grinned. Beverly gets what she wants. If only you knew, Brian thought, drowning his guilt in whiskey. Meanwhile, Beverly was across town at her family's law firm, meeting with their attorney Nathan Lamb. The McKnight family had retained Lamb's services for decades, and he was well-versed in the kind of legal arrangements that appeared completely legitimate on the surface. The timing has to be perfect, Beverly explained, reviewing the insurance documents. Any delay between the incident and the claim could raise suspicions. Lamb, a thin man with sharp features and sharper instincts, had helped the McKnight family bury more secrets than he cared to count. The policy is solid. As long as the death appears accidental, there shouldn't be any complications. And Brian's involvement? completely untraceable. He's the grieving partner who tried to save his best friend. If anything, his testimony will strengthen the accidental death ruling. Beverly smiled, the expression transforming her beautiful face into something predatory. Then we're ready. What neither Beverly nor Brian realized was that Alexander Ferris wasn't quite as trusting as he appeared. Years of firefighting had taught him to notice details, and his wife's recent behavior had triggered every alarm in his experienced mind. He'd been quietly investigating, following her to the Drake Hotel twice, noting the expensive gifts that didn't match her claimed income. He'd even hired a private investigator, Harry Kane, a former police detective who specialized in domestic cases. Kane's preliminary report sat in Alexander's truck, detailing Beverly's affair with Brian and her family's questionable business practices. But the report was incomplete. Kane hadn't yet uncovered the murder plot. As Alexander prepared for what he thought would be another routine night shift, he had no idea that his wife and best friend were planning his death. But his survival instincts, honed by years of walking into burning buildings, would prove stronger than their carefully laid trap. The warehouse fire would change everything, but not in the way Beverly and Brian expected. Chapter 3: Baptism by Fire. The warehouse on Porter Street erupted like a vision of hell as Alexander and Brian approached the building. Flames shot through broken windows, and thick black smoke billowed into the October night sky. Alexander felt his pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with walking into danger. Structurally compromised, Brian shouted over the roar of the fire, checking his watch. 8:52 p.m. 13 minutes until the planned collapse. Maybe we should wait for backup. Alexander shot him a look of disbelief. Since when do you wait for backup? He adjusted his oxygen mask and headed toward the main entrance. Building this size, there could be vagrants inside. We go in fast, sweep the ground floor, and get out. Brian's mouth went dry. According to Beverly's timeline, they needed to be in the southwest corner of the building when the support beam fell. But Alexander was heading for the northeast entrance, disrupting the plan. Wait, Brian grabbed his partner's arm. The fire's stronger on that side. We should enter from the loading dock. Alexander paused, studying the building. His 12 years of experience told him Brian was wrong. The northeast entrance offered better visibility and faster escape routes. But his trust in his partner overrode his instincts. All right, lead the way. As they moved toward the loading dock, Beverly McKnight Ferris sat in her BMW 3 blocks away, watching the fire through binoculars. At exactly 9:05 p.m., the support beam would fall, crushing her husband and freeing her to claim his insurance money. She'd already prepared her grieving widow act, complete with the perfect black dress hanging in her closet. Inside the warehouse, Alexander and Brian moved through corridors filled with dense smoke and scattered debris. The heat was intense, even through their protective gear. Alexander swept his flashlight beam across the smoke-filled space, looking for any sign of life. Clear so far, he called back to Brian. Let's check the office spaces. Brian checked his watch again. 9:01 p.m. For minutes. His hands shook as he followed Alexander deeper into the building. The plan was simple. Lead Alexander to the marked spot, then excuse himself to check another area. When the beam fell, Brian would be safely near the exit while Alexander was trapped. Over here, Brian called, directing Alexander toward the southwest corner. Thought I heard something. Alexander followed, his trust in Brian overriding every survival instinct screaming at him to leave the building. As they approached the marked area, Brian began to position himself for his escape. I'll check the office, Brian said, pointing to a doorway that would put him safely out of range. You sweep this section. That's when Alexander heard it, a sound that made his blood freeze. Not the groan of stressed timber or the pop of exploding glass, but the distinctive ping of a countdown timer. In 12 years of firefighting, he'd never heard that sound in a natural fire. Brian, Alexander's voice was sharp with sudden understanding. This isn't an electrical fire. Brian's face went white behind his mask. What do you mean? The burn pattern, the smell, the sound, this fire was set. Alexander's training kicked in. analyzing the evidence his subconscious had been cataloging. And there's an accelerant. We need to. The building shuddered. Not the random collapse of a fire-damaged structure, but the precise failure of a deliberately weakened support beam. Alexander looked up just as a massive wooden beam, easily weighing several tons, broke free from the ceiling. Time slowed to a crawl. Alexander saw Brian's face, not surprised, but terrified in a way that spoke of guilty knowledge. He saw his partner take a step backward towards safety, while the beam fell directly toward Alexander's position. "Brian!" Alexander screamed, diving sideways. The beam missed his head, but caught his legs, pinning him to the concrete floor with crushing force. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but not as devastating as the realization dawning in Alexander's mind. Brian stood frozen in the doorway, safety just steps away. Alexander could see his partner's face clearly now, guilt, fear, and something that looked almost like relief. "Brian, help me." Alexander's voice cracked with desperation and growing understanding. "Get this beam off me." Brian took a step forward, then stopped. His phone buzzed with a text from Beverly. "Is it done?" "I'm sorry, man." Brian's voice was barely audible over the roar of the growing fire. "Your wife wants you dead." The words hit Alexander harder than the falling beam. 5 years of marriage, 8 years of partnership, all of it lies. As Brian turned to run, leaving his trapped partner to burn alive, Alexander felt something inside him die. Not from the smoke or flames, but from the complete destruction of everything he believed about the people he loved. "Brian!" Alexander's scream was primal, filled with rage and betrayal. "I'll find you. I'll make you pay." But Brian was already gone, running toward the exit and the promise of Beverly's arms and insurance money. Alexander lay trapped as the fire closed in around him. The smoke was getting thicker, his oxygen running low. But instead of panic, he felt something else growing inside him. A cold, calculating fury that burned hotter than the flames surrounding him. Using his firefighter training, Alexander managed to shift the beam enough to free one leg. The other was clearly broken, possibly shattered, but he could move. Inch by agonizing inch, he dragged himself toward a window he'd spotted during their initial sweep. The ceiling began to collapse in sections as Alexander reached the window. Using his axe, he smashed through the glass and pulled himself through, falling 2 stories to the alley below. He landed hard on a pile of construction debris, his already injured leg twisting at an unnatural angle. As consciousness faded, Alexander could hear sirens approaching. He forced himself to stay awake long enough to see Brian emerge from the building, playing his role as the devastated partner who'd been separated from his friend in the smoke. Beverly arrived as the paramedics loaded Alexander into the ambulance. Her grief was perfectly performed, just the right amount of tears, just the right tremor in her voice. But when she thought no one was looking, Alexander caught a glimpse of something else in her eyes: disappointment. As the ambulance doors closed, Alexander Ferris made a promise to himself. He would survive. He would recover. And then he would show Beverly McKnight Ferris and Brian Garner what real fire looked like. The man who woke up in that hospital bed would be very different from the trusting husband and partner who'd walked into that warehouse. Alexander Ferris was dead. What remained was something far more dangerous. Chapter 4: Resurrection. Alexander Ferris awoke in Northwestern Memorial Hospital to the steady beep of machines and the antiseptic smell of medical equipment. His left leg was suspended in traction, metal pins holding shattered bones together. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the fire burning in his chest, the need for revenge. "Thank God you're awake." Beverly's voice was perfectly pitched with relief and exhaustion. She sat beside his bed, looking like the ideal grieving wife in her designer jeans and cashmere sweater. "The doctors said they weren't sure you'd make it." Alexander studied his wife's face, seeing her clearly for the first time. The practiced concern, the way her eyes didn't quite meet his, the expensive watch he'd never seen before glinting on her wrist. "How long have I been out?" 3 days. The smoke inhalation was severe in your leg. She gestured helplessly at the traction device. They had to operate twice. Through the window, Alexander could see Brian Garner pacing in the hallway, his partner's face a mask of what looked like genuine guilt and worry. The performance was almost convincing. Brian's been here every day, Beverly continued. He's devastated about what happened. Says he got separated from you in the smoke and couldn't find you in time. Where exactly did he find the exit? Alexander's voice was carefully neutral. Beverly's pause was microscopic, but Alexander caught it. I'm not sure. He was pretty shaken up. Why don't you ask him yourself? When Brian entered the room, Alexander watched his former best friend's approach with the analytical eye of a predator studying prey. Brian's grief appeared genuine, but Alexander now knew how skilled a liar his partner was. Jesus, Alex, I thought I'd lost you. Brian's voice cracked. I searched everywhere, but the smoke was so thick, and when the ceiling started coming down. Tell me exactly what happened after we got separated, Alexander said quietly. Brian launched into a detailed story about losing Alexander in the smoke, desperately searching and barely escaping himself when the structure became too unstable. It was a good story, well-rehearsed and emotionally convincing. But Alexander noticed the tells, the way Brian's left eye twitched when he described searching for his partner, the slight delay before each emotional beat. Over the next week, as Alexander endured painful physical therapy and pretended to believe their lies, he began planning. The private investigator's report he'd hidden in his truck became his starting point, but he needed more. Much more. His first call was to Derek Stark, a former Army Ranger who now worked as a private security consultant. Alexander had saved Stark's life during a house fire 2 years earlier, and the debt had never been repaid. I need surveillance equipment, Alexander told him during a brief phone call, speaking quietly while Beverly was out getting coffee. The kind that can't be detected. What kind of trouble are you in, Ferris? The kind where everyone I trusted is trying to kill me. Stark's voice hardened. I'll be there in an hour. The second call was to Theodore Bishop, a forensic accountant who specialized in uncovering hidden assets. Bishop had helped several divorced firefighters track down money their ex-wives had tried to hide, and his reputation for thoroughness was legendary. I need everything you can find on Beverly McKnight Ferris and the McKnight family businesses, Alexander explained. Financial records, property holdings, business associates, everything. This is about the warehouse fire, isn't it? Bishop's voice was grim, words getting around that something didn't smell right about that call. Alexander felt a surge of hope. If other people were asking questions, his survival might not have been as surprising to Beverly and Brian as they'd let on. His third call was the most important. Dr. Lauren Mercer was a trauma surgeon at Northwestern, but more importantly, she was Alexander's ex-girlfriend from before his marriage to Beverly. Lauren had never liked Beverly, claiming she could see the coldness beneath the beauty. Alexander had dismissed her concerns as jealousy. Now he realized Lauren had been trying to warn him. I need a favor, Alexander said when Lauren stopped by during her rounds. I need you to tell everyone my injuries are worse than they are. Lauren studied his face, her dark eyes intelligent and concerned. Alexander, what's really going on? I can't tell you everything yet, but I need time to heal and plan without Beverly and Brian knowing how quickly I'm recovering. This is about your accident, isn't it? It wasn't an accident. Alexander's silence was confirmation enough. I'll help, Lauren said simply. But promise me you'll be careful. Whatever you're planning, don't let it destroy who you are. Too late for that, Alexander thought, but he nodded. Over the following weeks, while maintaining the facade of a slowly healing invalid, Alexander began building his case. Stark surveillance equipment revealed the true extent of Beverly and Brian's relationship. Hidden cameras in Alexander's own home captured intimate conversations about their future together and casual discussions about the insurance money. Bishop's financial investigation uncovered a web of McKnight family corruption stretching back decades. Property acquisitions through intimidation, insurance fraud, and at least 3 suspicious deaths of business rivals. Beverly wasn't just an unfaithful wife. She was the heir to a criminal empire. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. James Wall, the warehouse owner, approached Alexander through a mutual acquaintance, racked with guilt over his role in the attempted murder. Your wife's family has owned me for years. Wall confessed during a secret meeting. They got me out of tax problem, and I've been paying the debt ever since. But I never thought they'd use my building to try to kill someone. Wall provided documentation of Beverly's demands for the warehouse modifications, including the deliberately weakened support beam and disabled sprinkler system. More importantly, he revealed that Beverly had planned similar accidents for other people who'd gotten in the McKnight family's way. As Alexander's strength returned and his evidence mounted, he began to feel something he hadn't experienced since the warehouse fire: joy. Not the simple happiness of his former life, but the dark satisfaction of a predator preparing to strike. Beverly and Brian thought they were dealing with the same trusting, honorable man they'd betrayed. They had no idea that Alexander Ferris had died in that warehouse fire, and what had emerged from the ashes was something far more dangerous. The reckoning was coming, and Alexander intended to make it legendary. Chapter 5. The Hunt Begins. 2 months after the warehouse fire, Alexander Ferris was officially cleared for light duty, though his doctors recommended at least another month of recovery. Beverly had been the perfect, devoted wife throughout his convalescence, bringing him meals, helping with physical therapy, and expressing constant concern for his welfare. Her performance was flawless, except for the moments when she thought he wasn't watching, moments when her mask slipped and revealed the cold calculation beneath. "I think you should take early retirement," Beverly suggested one evening as they sat in their Lakeview apartment. "With the insurance settlement from the accident and my real estate commissions, we'd be financially secure." Alexander looked up from the newspaper he was pretending to read, noting how Beverly's eyes lit up at the mention of insurance money. The settlement for his accidental injuries had been substantial, nearly $800,000. Combined with his life insurance policy that Beverly had failed to collect, it represented serious money. "I'm not ready to quit," Alexander replied. "Fighting fires is who I am." Beverly's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "But think about our future. We could travel, maybe start that family we've talked about." The idea of bringing children into the world with this woman made Alexander's stomach turn. He'd already made arrangements to ensure that could never happen, but Beverly didn't know that yet. "Let me think about it," he said, returning to his newspaper, which concealed detailed surveillance photos of Beverly and Brian's afternoon rendezvous at the Palmer House Hotel. While Beverly plotted in their living room, Alexander's real life was taking place in a rented warehouse space on the south side of Chicago. With Derek Stark's help, he'd created a command center that would have impressed any military operation. Wall-mounted monitors displayed surveillance feeds from 12 different locations. Financial records covered a massive corkboard, and a detailed timeline of Beverly and Brian's activities stretched across an entire wall. "Your wife's meeting with her lawyer again," Stark reported, reviewing footage from earlier that day. Same pattern. Nathan Lamb's office, then lunch with Brian, then back to her real estate office to maintain her cover. Alexander studied the surveillance photos spread across his desk. Beverly and Brian had grown careless in their confidence, believing their victim was slowly recovering and had no idea of their betrayal. Their affair had become more blatant, their discussions about their future together more detailed. "What about the McKnight family businesses?" Alexander asked. Theodore Bishop emerged from behind a computer setup that looked like mission control. "The deeper I dig, the worse it gets. The McKnight family has been running a criminal enterprise for 40 years. Property fraud, insurance scams, and at least 7 suspicious deaths that were ruled accidental." Bishop handed Alexander a thick folder. "Your wife isn't just the daughter of criminals. She's been actively involved in the family business since college. 3 separate instances where business rivals suffered accidents after refusing McKnight family offers." Alexander opened the folder, studying photographs and documents that painted a picture of Beverly as a calculating killer who'd been perfecting her craft for years. His attempted murder wasn't an aberration. It was part of a pattern. "There's more," Bishop continued. "I traced the insurance policies on all 7 victims. In each case, the payout went to someone connected to the McKnight family. We're not talking about isolated incidents here. This is a systematic operation." The revelation that he'd married a serial killer should have shocked Alexander, but instead, he felt a cold satisfaction. Beverly's crimes gave him justification for what he was planning, revenge that would go far beyond simple justice. His phone buzzed with a text from Brian. "Want to grab a beer tonight?" "Been too long." Alexander smiled, the expression transforming his face into something predatory. "Derek, I need you to prepare the special room." The special room was a soundproof space in the warehouse basement, equipped with everything Alexander would need for the interrogation phase of his plan. Stark had designed it based on his military experience, creating an environment where truth was the only option. That evening, Alexander met Brian at Murphy's Tavern, the firefighters' usual hangout. Brian seemed genuinely happy to see him, playing the role of the loyal friend perfectly. "You look good, Alex," Brian said, signaling for 2 beers. "Really good. The leg healing up okay?" "Better every day," Alexander replied, noting how Brian's relief seemed real. Did his former partner actually feel guilty about the attempted murder, or was he just concerned about getting caught? "Listen, I need to tell you something." Brian's voice dropped to a whisper. "I've been having nightmares about that night, about not being able to find you in the smoke. Sometimes I wake up screaming." Alexander studied Brian's face, seeing genuine torment there. For a moment, he almost felt sorry for his former friend. Then he remembered the words, "Your wife wants you dead." "We both did everything we could," Alexander said, his voice warm with false understanding. "Some situations, there's no good choices." Brian's grateful smile was painful to watch. "Thanks, man. I needed to hear that." They spent 2 hours drinking and reminiscing, with Brian gradually relaxing as he convinced himself that Alexander suspected nothing. When Brian excused himself to use the restroom, Alexander slipped a GPS tracker under his truck's bumper, one of several surveillance devices Stark had provided. As the evening ended, Alexander felt a surge of anticipation. The hunting phase was complete. He knew his enemies' patterns, their weaknesses, and their crimes. Now came the part he'd been looking forward to since waking up in that hospital bed. The destruction of Beverly McKnight Ferris and Brian Garner would be systematic, thorough, and absolutely merciless. They'd shown him no mercy in that burning warehouse, and he would return the favor with interest. But first, he needed to set the stage. The next morning, Alexander began implementing Phase 1 of his revenge plan. Beverly and Brian thought they were predators, but they were about to learn what it felt like to be prey. The hunt was about to begin. Chapter 6: The Trap Springs. 3 weeks into his revenge campaign, Alexander Ferris had become a ghost haunting his enemies' lives. Beverly and Brian had no idea they were being systematically destroyed, their world carefully dismantled piece by piece while they continued their charade of grief and concern. Alexander's first target was Brian's career. Using information Stark had gathered about Brian's financial difficulties, gambling debts, expensive gifts for Beverly, and a lifestyle he couldn't afford on a firefighter's salary, Alexander began feeding anonymous tips to internal affairs about Brian's suspicious behavior. The genius was in the details. Alexander knew Brian's patterns better than anyone, knew exactly when his former partner broke protocol or cut corners. Every minor violation was documented and reported, creating a paper trail that suggested Brian was becoming unreliable and potentially dangerous. Garner's under investigation for equipment violations. Lieutenant Gerard Myers informed the squad during morning briefing. Until further notice, he's restricted to station duties. Alexander watched Brian's face crumble as his career, the one stable thing in his life besides his relationship with Beverly, began to slip away. But this was just the beginning. Phase 2 targeted Beverly's real estate empire. Theodore Bishop had uncovered a network of shell companies and fraudulent transactions that stretched back years. Rather than expose everything at once, Alexander chose a more surgical approach. He began with Beverly's biggest client, a property development group called Morrison Holdings. Using evidence Bishop had gathered about the McKnight family's intimidation tactics, Alexander anonymously contacted Morrison's lawyers with documentation proving their business relationship was based on fraud and coercion. Within 48 hours, Morrison Holdings terminated all contracts with Beverly's firm and launched their own investigation into the McKnight family's business practices. The cancellation cost Beverly nearly $2 million in anticipated commissions. "I don't understand what happened," Beverly told Alexander that evening, her usual composure cracking slightly. "Morrison's lawyers won't even take my calls." "Maybe they found a better deal elsewhere," Alexander suggested, his voice full of sympathetic concern while internally savoring her distress. But Alexander's most devastating move was yet to come. James Wall, the warehouse owner, had provided more than just documentation of Beverly's murder plot. He'd also revealed the existence of a secret recording system in the McKnight family's law office, security footage that captured decades of criminal conspiracies. Working with Stark, Alexander had gained access to these recordings. Hours of Beverly, her father, and various family members discussing murders, fraudulent insurance claims, and business rivals who needed to be handled permanently. The recordings were a treasure trove of evidence, but Alexander had no intention of turning them over to police. Instead, he planned to use them as leverage in the final phase of his revenge. Meanwhile, Beverly and Brian's relationship was beginning to show strain under pressure. Alexander knew this because he was listening to every conversation they had. Stark's surveillance equipment had turned their apartment, Brian's truck, and even Beverly's office into Alexander's personal intelligence network. "The insurance investigator is asking more questions," Beverly told Brian during one of their secret meetings. "He wants to interview you again about what happened in the warehouse." "I told them everything I know," Brian replied, but Alexander could hear the fear in his voice. "Maybe we should just take what we have and disappear for a while. Run away." Beverly's voice turned ice cold. "We're not running anywhere. Alexander is alive, which complicates things, but he's also disabled and dependent on me. We stick to the plan. What if he remembers something? What if he figures out?" "He won't," Beverly cut him off. "Alexander is exactly the same trusting fool he always was. He looks at me and sees his devoted wife, not someone who tried to have him killed." Alexander smiled grimly as he listened to the recording. Beverly's confidence would be her downfall. The pressure finally broke Brian a week later. Alexander watched through surveillance cameras as his former partner sat in his truck outside Beverly's office, drinking straight whiskey and crying. The guilt, the fear of discovery, and the mounting evidence against him at work had pushed Brian to his breaking point. That's when Alexander made his move. He called Brian from a burner phone, disguising his voice as a police investigator. "Mr. Garner, this is Detective Collins with CPD. We need to discuss some discrepancies in your statement about the warehouse fire." Brian's panic was immediate and total. "I told you everything I know. I don't understand what discrepancies. Perhaps you'd prefer to discuss this in person? We have some recordings that might refresh your memory." The line went dead as Brian hung up, but Alexander had planted the seed. Within an hour, surveillance cameras captured Brian racing to Beverly's office, wild-eyed and desperate. Their argument was explosive. Brian wanted to confess everything and hope for leniency. Beverly wanted to eliminate the problem permanently, meaning Alexander. "He's already suspicious," Brian pleaded, "and now the police are asking questions about recordings. What if they have surveillance from the warehouse?" "Then we accelerate the timeline," Beverly replied coldly. "Alexander has another accident. This time, we make sure it's fatal." Alexander felt a surge of cold satisfaction as he listened to them plan his second murder. They were giving him everything he needed to justify what came next. That night, as Beverly lay sleeping beside him, Alexander received a text from Stark. "Phase 3 assets in position. Ready when you are." Alexander looked down at his wife's peaceful face, remembering the woman he'd thought he loved. That woman had never existed. In her place lay a killer who'd tried to murder him once and was planning to do it again. He typed back a single word, "Go." The end game was about to begin, and Beverly McKnight Ferris and Brian Garner were about to discover that sometimes the prey becomes the predator. Alexander Ferris was done being a victim. Now it was time to become an executioner. Chapter 7: The Reckoning. The abandoned meat packing plant on Chicago's South Side had been closed for 15 years. Its broken windows and rusted machinery creating the perfect backdrop for what Alexander Ferris had planned. At 2:47 a.m., Brian Garner's truck pulled into the empty parking lot, drawn by an anonymous tip that Alexander had supposedly discovered their plan and was meeting with federal investigators. Brian stepped out of his truck, a .38 revolver hidden in his jacket. Beverly had convinced him that killing Alexander was their only option, that their former victim was too dangerous to leave alive. What Brian didn't know was that Alexander had been orchestrating every step of this confrontation. "I know you're here, Alex," Brian called into the darkness, his voice cracking with fear and desperation. "We need to talk." Alexander emerged from the shadows, no longer the trusting friend Brian remembered. His gray eyes held the cold intensity of a predator, and his movements were fluid and predatory despite his supposed leg injury. "Hello, Brian." Alexander's voice was calm, almost conversational. "I've been waiting for this conversation for months." Brian's hand moved toward his weapon, but Alexander was faster. Derek Stark materialized behind Brian, pressing a taser to his former partner's neck. Brian collapsed, convulsing as electricity coursed through his body. "Careful with him," Alexander instructed as Stark secured Brian with zip ties. "I want him conscious for what comes next." They dragged Brian into the plant's main building, where Alexander had prepared a special welcome. Stark had rigged the space with military-grade interrogation equipment, lights, cameras, and tools designed to extract truth from even the most stubborn subjects. When Brian regained consciousness, he found himself strapped to a chair in the center of the room, surrounded by monitors displaying surveillance footage of his affair with Beverly, recordings of their planning sessions, and photographs documenting the warehouse fire setup. "Welcome to Judgment Day," Alexander said, pulling up a chair directly in front of his captive. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about that night." Brian's eyes darted around the room, taking in the evidence of his crimes displayed on every screen. "Alex, I can explain. Your wife wants you dead." Alexander quoted Brian's own words back to him. "That's what you said before you left me to burn. Do you remember?" The color drained from Brian's face. "You were unconscious. The beam had you pinned. I thought you were. You thought I was dead, so you didn't bother checking." Alexander leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But more importantly, you knew that beam was going to fall. You knew exactly when and where." Brian tried to deny it, but Alexander played audio recordings of Beverly explaining the warehouse modifications, the timeline, and Brian's role in positioning Alexander at the correct location. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. "Please," Brian broke down completely, tears streaming down his face. "It wasn't my idea. Beverly convinced me. She said it would be quick, that you wouldn't suffer." "But I did suffer," Alexander replied calmly. "I suffered the physical pain of broken bones and burned lungs. But worse, I suffered the knowledge that the two people I trusted most in the world had betrayed me for money." He stood, walking to a table covered with various tools. "Now you're going to suffer too." What followed was 3 hours of systematic psychological torture. Alexander didn't lay a hand on Brian, but he destroyed him completely nonetheless. He played recordings of Beverly discussing how easily she'd manipulated Brian, how she planned to eliminate him once the insurance money was secured, and how she'd already identified his replacement. "She's planning to kill you, Brian," Alexander explained as his former partner sobbed. "The same way she killed her father's business rivals, the same way she tried to kill me. You're not her partner. You're just another victim." By dawn, Brian had confessed everything. The murder plot, Beverly's family's criminal enterprise, and the names of everyone involved in the conspiracy. Alexander recorded every word, building an airtight case that would destroy the McKnight family completely. "What happens now?" Brian asked, his voice broken. "Now you disappear," Alexander replied. "Permanently." But Alexander had no intention of killing Brian. Death would be too merciful. Instead, Stark's contacts in federal witness protection would provide Brian with a new identity in exchange for his testimony against the McKnight family. Brian would spend the rest of his life in hiding, knowing that Beverly was still out there and might find him someday. As Stark transported the broken man to his new life of perpetual fear, Alexander returned home to find Beverly pacing their apartment, clearly agitated. "Brian never came home last night," she told him, her mask of concern not quite hiding her panic. I'm worried something happened to him. Maybe he finally realized what kind of person you really are, Alexander suggested quietly. Beverly's head snapped up, studying his face for signs of suspicion. What do you mean? Nothing. Just that Brian's been acting strange lately. Guilty about something. Alexander watched Beverly process this information, seeing her mind race through possibilities. Did Brian confess? Did he disappear because he was afraid? Or had Alexander discovered their plot? I need to go to the office, Beverly said, grabbing her purse. If Brian calls, let me know immediately. As soon as Beverly left, Alexander activated the final phase of his plan. Theodore Bishop had spent months preparing legal documents that would transfer all McKnight family assets to a series of shell companies controlled by Alexander. The documentation was complex but airtight, using the family's own illegal methods against them. Simultaneously, Alexander released the warehouse recordings to multiple law enforcement agencies. The FBI, Chicago PD, and the state attorney's office would all receive identical packages containing decades of evidence about McKnight family crimes. By noon, federal agents were raiding McKnight properties while Beverly sat in a client meeting, completely unaware that her world was collapsing around her. Alexander watched the raid through news coverage, savoring every moment of the family's destruction. Beverly's phone rang constantly as the investigation unfolded, but Alexander had ensured she couldn't be reached. The anonymous tip that had drawn her to a fake client meeting would keep her isolated until the trap was completely sprung. When Beverly finally returned home that evening, she found Alexander waiting in their living room with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. We need to celebrate, he told her, his smile warm and loving. I have wonderful news. Beverly's relief was visible as she accepted the wine, convinced that whatever had happened to Brian, Alexander remained oblivious to their plot. What are we celebrating? She asked, settling into the couch beside him. The end of your family's criminal empire, Alexander replied calmly, raising his glass in a toast. To justice finally being served. Beverly's wine glass shattered on the floor as the full implications of his words hit her. She looked into Alexander's eyes and saw the truth. He knew everything, and he'd been playing her for months. You've been very patient, Beverly, Alexander continued conversationally. Waiting for the insurance money, planning my second murder, thinking you were so clever. But you made one critical mistake. What mistake? Beverly's voice was barely a whisper. Alexander's smile turned predatory. You should have made sure I was actually dead. Chapter 8. The Serpent's Den. Beverly McKnight Ferris sat frozen on her living room couch, wine dripping from the shattered glass at her feet as she stared into the eyes of a man she no longer recognized. The husband who had loved her unconditionally was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating that wore Alexander's face. How long have you known? Beverly's voice was steady, but Alexander caught the slight tremor that betrayed her fear. Since the warehouse, Alexander replied, setting down his wine and pulling out a tablet. It's amazing what you can accomplish when people think you're a helpless invalid. He swiped through surveillance photos, financial records, and audio recordings, months of evidence that documented every aspect of Beverly's criminal life. Her face grew paler with each revelation. The McKnight family empire is finished, Alexander continued matter-of-factly. Federal agents seized all your properties an hour ago. Your father's in custody, along with Nathan Lamb and 12 other associates. The insurance money you were counting on? Frozen pending investigation. Beverly's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the predator beneath. You think you've won? You have no idea what you're dealing with. I know exactly what I'm dealing with. Alexander stood, towering over her. A serial killer who uses marriage and friendship to get close to her victims. 7 people, Beverly. 7 innocent people murdered for insurance money and property deals. They weren't innocent, Beverly snarled, her true nature finally emerging. They were obstacles. Weak people who didn't understand how the world really works. Alexander felt a surge of satisfaction. After months of pretending to love this monster, it was liberating to see her without the mask. Like I was an obstacle, he asked. Like Brian. Beverly's eyes sharpened. Where is Brian? Gone. Disappeared. Permanently. Alexander let her imagination fill in the details. He was quite talkative before he left, though. Gave us everything we needed to destroy your family. For the first time, genuine fear flickered across Beverly's face. Not fear of prison or exposure, but fear of Alexander himself. She was beginning to understand that the man standing before her was no longer bound by the moral constraints that had once made him an easy victim. You can't prove anything. Beverly tried one last bluff. It's all circumstantial evidence. No prosecutor would. Actually, they would. Alexander played an audio recording of Beverly discussing murder plans with Brian. Her own voice filled the room, casual and cold as she described weakening the warehouse beam and timing the collapse. Beverly lunged for the tablet, but Alexander caught her wrist easily. His grip was iron-strong, and for the first time in her life, she was completely outmatched physically. 7 people, Alexander repeated, his voice growing colder. Starting with your college boyfriend who was going to break up with you. Carbon monoxide, poisoning made to look like suicide. Beverly's eyes widened. She'd been 19 when she'd killed David, certain she'd covered her tracks perfectly. Then your father's business partner, who questioned the McKnight family's methods. Electrical fire in his workshop. Alexander's recitation was relentless. Your aunt who was going to expose the insurance fraud. Overdose of prescription medication. Each revelation hit Beverly like a physical blow. Alexander had uncovered crimes she'd thought were buried forever. And then there was me, Alexander concluded. The trusting husband who was worth more dead than alive. Beverly jerked her hand free, rubbing her wrist where Alexander's grip had left marks. What do you want? Money? I can get you money. I want justice. Alexander's smile was terrifying in its gentleness, but not the kind that comes from courts and prisons. Before Beverly could react, Alexander's phone buzzed. He answered with a calm, yes, while maintaining eye contact with his wife. It's done. Derek Stark's voice came through the speaker. Package delivered as requested. Excellent timing, Alexander replied, ending the call. Beverly's confusion was evident. What package? What's done? Alexander walked to the window, gesturing for her to join him. Across the street, a black sedan was parked under a streetlight. Even from their third-floor apartment, Beverly could see the distinctive build of the man behind the wheel. That's Luther Alexander, Alexander explained conversationally. He works for some very unpleasant people in Eastern Europe. People who have strong opinions about individuals who steal their money through fraudulent property deals. The color drained from Beverly's face. The Kozlov contract. But that was 5 years ago. $7 million in property fraud? Alexander nodded. The statute of limitations doesn't expire for the Kozlov organization. They've been looking for the people responsible for a very long time. Beverly backed away from the window, her composure finally cracking completely. You wouldn't. You're not a killer. You're right, Alexander agreed. I'm not a killer, but I'm also not particularly interested in protecting someone who tried to murder me. He pulled out his phone and showed Beverly a text message thread. Screenshots of McKnight family financial records, property transfers, and Beverly's personal involvement in the Kozlov fraud were already winging their way to very dangerous people. The beauty of this approach, Alexander explained, is that I don't have to kill you myself. I just have to stop protecting you from the consequences of your own actions. Beverly was hyperventilating now, the weight of her crimes finally crushing down on her. The Kozlov organization didn't use courts or prisons. They used much more direct methods of debt collection. Please, she whispered, the word tasting like poison in her mouth. I'll disappear. I'll give you everything. Just don't. Don't what? Alexander's voice was genuinely curious. Don't let justice finally catch up with you. Don't allow your victims to be avenged. He moved closer, his presence now genuinely intimidating. You made a choice in that warehouse, Beverly. You chose to watch me burn rather than show mercy. Now I'm making the same choice. The sedan across the street started its engine, the sound carrying clearly through the night air. Beverly looked out the window again, seeing Luther Alexander climb out of the car and begin walking toward their building. You have about 3 minutes, Alexander told his wife calmly. The fire escape leads to the alley. Your car is in the garage. If you're very clever and very lucky, you might make it out of the city before they catch you. Beverly stared at him in disbelief. You're giving me a chance to run? I'm giving you the same chance you gave me in that warehouse, Alexander replied coldly. The chance to die slowly and afraid, knowing that the people who claimed to love you chose to watch you burn. Beverly bolted for the fire escape, her expensive heels echoing against metal stairs as she fled into the night. Alexander watched her go, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. As Luther Alexander's footsteps echoed in the building's stairwell, Alexander Ferris poured himself another glass of wine and settled into his chair. By morning, Beverly McKnight Ferris would be either dead or beginning a life of perpetual terror, always looking over her shoulder, never safe. Justice had many faces, and Alexander had learned to appreciate them all. Chapter 9. Phoenix Rising. 6 months later, Alexander Ferris stood in the empty shell of what had once been Beverly McKnight Ferris's real estate empire. The FBI had completed their investigation. The trials were over, and the McKnight family's criminal organization was scattered to the winds. Beverly herself had vanished the night Luther Alexander came calling, her fate unknown but assumed by most to be final. The morning newspaper lay folded on Alexander's new desk, its headline reading, McKnight family sentenced. Decades-long criminal enterprise finally brought to justice. The accompanying article detailed how an anonymous tip had provided law enforcement with recordings spanning 40 years of crimes, leading to the largest organized crime conviction in Chicago history. Dr. Lauren Mercer knocked on the doorframe of his temporary office. The final paperwork is complete, she said, entering with a manila folder. Congratulations, Mr. Ferris. You're now the sole owner of this building. Alexander accepted the deed, noting how different his life had become. The insurance settlements from his accidental injuries, combined with the seized McKnight assets that had been awarded to victims of their crimes, had made him a wealthy man. But wealth had never been the point. Any word from the investigators about Beverly? Lauren asked carefully. The case is officially closed, Alexander replied. No body was ever found, but given the circumstances. He shrugged, letting Lauren draw her own conclusions. In truth, Alexander had received one final communication from Beverly, a desperate email sent from an internet cafe in Prague 3 months earlier. The message was brief. They found me. I'm sorry for everything. You won. He deleted it immediately, feeling nothing but mild curiosity about whether she'd suffered before the end. Brian Garner had fared slightly better, but only slightly. His testimony against the McKnight family had earned him witness protection, but Alexander's contacts in federal law enforcement provided regular updates on his former partner's new life. Brian now worked as a janitor in a small town in Montana, drinking heavily and starting at Shadows, convinced that Beverly or her family's remaining associates would eventually track him down. Alexander's phone buzzed with a text from Derek Stark. New client wants to meet. Says he has an interesting proposition. Send him up, Alexander replied, curious about what kind of business opportunity would bring someone to his door. The man who entered 5 minutes later was impeccably dressed, with silver hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He introduced himself as Ernest Austin, though Alexander suspected that wasn't his real name. Mr. Ferris, Austin said, settling into the chair across from Alexander's desk. I represent certain individuals who were impressed by your recent problem-solving techniques. Alexander raised an eyebrow. I'm not sure what you mean. The McKnight situation, Austin clarified. Very elegant work. Surgical precision, no unnecessary collateral damage, and justice serve in a way that traditional law enforcement couldn't achieve. I'm a firefighter, Mr. Austin. I respond to emergencies and save lives. Austin smiled. Indeed, and sometimes the most effective way to save lives is to remove the threats that endanger them. He opened a briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. I have a proposition for you. There are other Beverly McKnight Ferrises in the world, predators who use the system's weaknesses to escape justice. People who hurt innocents and face no consequences because they're too clever, too connected, or too careful. Alexander opened the folder, finding detailed profiles of several individuals whose crimes made Beverly look like an amateur. A judge who sold verdicts to the highest bidder. A pharmaceutical executive who knowingly distributed fatal drugs. A human trafficking ring protected by political connections. These people can't be touched through conventional channels, Austin continued. But someone with your particular skills and moral flexibility could ensure they face appropriate consequences. You're asking me to become a vigilante, Alexander said flatly. I'm asking you to become a surgeon, Austin corrected. Someone who removes cancers that threaten the body politic. The compensation would be substantial, and you'd have the satisfaction of knowing that genuine evil was being eliminated from the world. Alexander studied the files, feeling a familiar cold fire building in his chest. The same desire for justice that had driven his revenge against Beverly was stirring again, awakened by the sight of unpunished monsters who preyed on the innocent. I'll need complete operational freedom, Alexander said finally. No oversight, no restrictions on methods, and absolute confidentiality. Austin's smile widened. I was hoping you'd say that. 2 weeks later, Alexander Ferris officially retired from the Chicago Fire Department, citing ongoing complications from his warehouse injuries. His colleagues threw him a farewell party, toasting his years of service and wishing him well in his new security consulting business. Lieutenant Gerard Myers pulled him aside as the party wound down. You know, Ferris, that warehouse fire never sat right with me. Too many coincidences, too many convenient failures. Sometimes bad things just happen, Alexander replied. Myers studied his face for a long moment. Yes, sometimes they do, but sometimes justice finds a way, even when the system fails. Alexander met his eyes steadily. I've always believed in justice, Lieutenant, no matter what form it takes. That night, Alexander stood on his apartment balcony, looking out over the city lights of Chicago. Somewhere out, there were predators who thought themselves untouchable, monsters who believed their wealth or connections made them immune to consequences. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Alexander Ferris, the trusting husband and loyal partner, was dead, burned away in a warehouse fire along with his faith in human goodness. What remained was something harder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. A weapon aimed at the heart of injustice itself. His phone buzzed with a message from Austin. First assignment details attached. Target, Judge Ricardo Klein, suspected of taking bribes in child custody cases. Children being sold to abusers for $50,000 per verdict. Alexander read the file, feeling the familiar cold fire building in his chest. Judge Klein thought his robes and connections made him untouchable. He was about to discover that some flames burned too hot to be extinguished by mere authority. The phoenix had risen from the ashes of betrayal, and it was hungry for justice. Alexander Ferris smiled as he began planning his next hunt. Some people needed saving from fire. Others needed to burn in it.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.